I just want to say thank you for all of you who've come, because there's more people here than the last time we did this event. So that just goes to show that there's a little more interest and a little more steam going in everybody's mindsets for actually trying to improve their minds and get better at the game that's being played on us. And these two are master craftsmen at their work. As most here know, because I do see a lot of familiar faces, but I'm also just as equally thankful to know that I see a whole bunch that I don't know. So my family got involved with Matthew and Cynthia a long time ago. They blew our minds through a Reiner Fulmick presentation, and then that was it. Everything flowed forward after that. We got hooked up, and for those who do know my family, now we're high advocates for the knowledge that Matthew and Cynthia have to offer, because we believe it's essential into understanding not only Canada, but the game that's at play that leads to Ottawa, that leads to things like City of London, that leads to what people would like to say are conspiracies. And yet, if you actually think about it, if you're on a CA board and you're sitting down and having a conversation about how to help your community with a bunch of people, that too is conspiracy. So people have set into motions their intentions for how they would like to run this world without our buy and leave or our input. We are trying to change that dynamic. With this knowledge, then we can have the conversations that edify those that are around us, build them up. We get better, and then the people that are trying to shove their intentions down our throats will be messing with minds that are sharp, keen, capable. It's a skill. It takes time, but we can do it. So without further ado, my good friend, you Eric.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you for the whole Holmes clan. By the way, the whole reason why Cynthia and I ended up in Calgary in the first place is that Mike and Noel and their excellent clan, their whole family, just sort of surprised us in the middle of a podcast with Jason Dahl, our video guy, who also has his own podcast. And halfway through the podcast, they were like, "Hey, Matthew, let me introduce you to a whole family that's been working on your work, on your books together as a group, and Cynthia's works." And we just started talking. And before we knew it, we found ourselves down a few months ago to just speak at an event just like this, same location. And I got to say, it's really, really edifying just to be in a culture. And there's something very different about Alberta than anything that Cynthia and I are used to on the East Coast, which is just good for the soul. I don't have to say any more than that. You know what I'm talking about. Today, I'm losing it. There we go. It's angular sensitive. Okay. So I'm really happy that we had such a great turnout, and I'm going to try the best of my powers to go through this presentation in the most effective way possible. There's a lot of big ideas. I don't want people to get overwhelmed, but I do want people to have the confidence to know that things that we thought were something that could only be speculated about is actually subjectable to the powers of knowledge and reason. The intellect can go further than you have imagined. So this will involve us playing a little bit, not with linear sequential ordering of timelines or geographical locations per se. We're going to be doing some bouncing around from the past to the present, to the past again. We're going to be looking from the big scale, top down, bottom up, and then back up again. We're going to do some bouncing. So we're going to get our minds into a more flexible place than maybe we're accustomed to. But I think that that's a healthy way of trying to approach analysis. Because we have to really, as Mike says, if we're going to be able to really wrap our minds around the causes of our problems, then we have to not only develop a quality of rigor, but really work those mind powers as a muscle like you would do in a gym, but then to think about also practical application in terms of both communicating to others and real communication, not just giving trivia information, but real communication means a power of transformation, right? Being able to set the mind of somebody who may not have a hunger to know what they need to know about putting out a fire that they maybe don't even believe exists. There's a lot of people, as we've all discovered, who it's like they're living in a house on fire, and they've been led to believe that there is no such thing as fire, so water doesn't make any sense to them. That means you got to awaken that thirst, right, for knowledge. That's very difficult, but it's doable, and it comes from speaking with knowledge. Don't jump the gun. And like a lot of people, they think little, speak lots. We have to really withhold and really assess all possibilities before we make a judgment. And the last thing I'll say before I launch into this thing, and it's going to be a bit of a wild ride, and I'm hoping we can get through this. I know, not hoping, we will get through this together pretty well. Is that there's a lot of misinformation spread all throughout the mental sphere right now. It's like a minefield. And those who have actually been the arsonists lighting our nations and our society on fire want us to put our fear and our anger at everything other than the thing itself. They don't want us to look at the arsonists in the village. Be afraid of Russia, be afraid of Iran, be afraid of China, be afraid of Muslims, be afraid of Jews, whatever. There's so many objects of hate that are being given to us right now to scatter our minds from really understanding what is the theme of history for the past 2,000 years. So we're gonna do that a little bit. We're gonna have some dialogue after this. Might be in that other side of the room. And yeah, let's just get the show on the road. So as you all know, we chose to label today's presentation From Templars to Jesuits, the Occult Underground Shaping World History. It's a cool title. But how to actually demonstrate that that's a fact of life. And I figured a great place to start would be a quote from a fellow that some of you may have recognized. Maybe some of you don't. Anybody don't know this guy here? I mean, obviously you see his name, but have you never heard of Albert Pike? Only a couple. That's good. All right. So this guy was a Confederate general and a Grand Master of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction Freemasonic Lodges, who renovated the entire Freemasonic structure of the Scottish Rite after the Civil War. He made a point. He was a high-level occultist. That's him in some of his 33rd degree regalia. He made a point in his book, Morals and Dogma. It's a very influential book amongst occultists, and so it's useful to read. But there's something that really popped out regarding his view on the Templars and Jesuits. He says, the Templars were unintelligent and therefore unsuccessful Jesuits. Their watchword was to become wealthy in order to buy the world. They became so, and in 1312, they possessed in Europe alone more than 9,000 seigneuries, feudal. Riches were the shoal on which they were wrecked. They became insolent and unwisely showed their contempt for the religious and social institutions which they aimed to overthrow. Their ambition was fatal to them. So first things first, he's establishing that the Jesuits and the Templars earlier have a continuity. There's something there. What is he a part of, first of all? So before we even go into that, let's just see, okay, he was also a member of something called the Knights of the Golden Circle. That's the emblem, has a little tip of the hat to Malta, a little solar Helios iconography around the edge. It had about 100,000 people strong. It was a paramilitary group amongst the Confederate South, built up in 1852. And all of the leading high-level Confederates and those who went on to found things like the KKK were members of this thing. Albert Pike, by the way, was a founding member of the KKK, set up in 1865. There's a reason why I'm saying this. The overarching dream and mission of the Golden Circle Knights was to set up a new empire broken free of the Union around basically an expansionist slave manifest destiny idea, with its center being in Cuba. Things like Oliver, no, never mind. United Fruit grew out of this operation. Sullivan and Cromwell, the legal house of the Dulles brothers, actually grew out of this too. And it was tied to the B'nai B'rith, set up around the same year. And it didn't work. It didn't work because people were a little bit smarter than they are in our day to the nature of some of these divide to conquer operations, and were able to keep the Union together. And this plan was basically aborted, but it wasn't abandoned. So we didn't see that that empire emerge when it was going to happen as a new world order back in the day, and it was very much aligned to the British Empire. I can't maximize it because something weird is happening with the PowerPoint. Sorry. But as I mentioned, the Knights of the Golden Circle reorganized themselves, and by 1865, that set up the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. The Knights of essentially, it's the same thing, the Golden Circle. And the fact that they're doing the Sig Heil is also not a coincidence. This is something which shouldn't be seen as different from the rise or the model of fascism that was applied to create a solution to the wars of the 20th century. And a lot of the same occultists who were operational within the Nazi high command, the SS, the Thule Society, were also very much tied to the thing that was active at this time, trying to push this this very peculiar structure of slave master society back then. Here's another thing here, before we jump into some pasts. This is a recent Good Friday Mass of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Something catch your eye about their choice of dress, right? This is a knighthood that was set up at the beginning of the First Crusade when the Temple of Jerusalem was set up. There's about 30,000 members, dames and knights still active, many of them are active in the Middle East, and they actually have a huge control over the educational systems active within Palestine, within many of the Middle Eastern countries tied to the UN. Who knew that? That surprised me when I first saw that. So there's long arcs. Sometimes things that happened 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago have more impact on our present condition than things that may have happened maybe a decade or even a year ago. And that's where conspiracy theory as a bad term was designed to destroy our ability to appreciate how thoughts shape history, even thoughts that are multi-generational, have an impact on the material, measurable reality, even if they've occurred generations ago. So let's look at some examples of other things happening today that you cannot properly understand the implications, the meaning, or the solutions of if you don't have a broader sweep of history. Here's a quick image of the geopolitical terrain today, featuring, I'm thinking a lot of people are probably pretty up to date with some of the flashpoints of the world. We have obviously 890 US military bases spread out around the world, run by an independent military industrial complex tied to intelligence agencies that have no regard for the people living in the United States or Canada or obviously Europe. Look what they're doing to them. But it's operating on its own agenda. And it's been that way. It hasn't gotten better since it murdered JFK. Let's just say that. And I'm not talking about anything that's run out of the Kremlin or Beijing. This is something else. But looking today, you have flashpoints around Taiwan as new Ukraine of the Pacific. You've got obviously the powder keg and the Gordian knots that have been set up as a time bomb in the Middle East around the Gaza, and a certain ideological matrix that has been baked into Israel over the course of many generations. That's being lit on fire. And then obviously you have something also in Ukraine that could be another trigger point as we now hear the discussion of long-range missiles being approved by Keir Starmer and many other governments. Justin Trudeau gave his resounding approval for the right of Kiev to utilize foreign long-range missiles with foreign infrastructure managed by foreign NATO-connected military officials to strike deep into the heart of Russia, which is basically playing with nuclear war. As Putin has said, he wasn't lying. That is a red line. On the positive side, what are they afraid of? Well, we have a collapsing banking system, right? That's also baked into the architecture of globalization. That's not something that happened as an accident blowing out maybe in the last 5-10 years. This was really baked into when Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and many other people running the Trilateral Commission floated the dollar right onto from the fixed exchange rate, the gold reserve standard back in '71, onto the speculative markets. And you had the age of consumerism, gambling instead of building things as a means to create wealth. And of course, that's a bubble. And just like the tulip bubble or any bubble, bubbles pop. It's a law of nature. And those who put the bubble into motion knew exactly what that was. So that's a collapsing transatlantic system. Then we have something that's been newly emerging and growing in a very creative way, tied to a different way of thinking about economics and politics and security. And it's been gaining steam. Here, of course, is just one rendition of the basic core arteries of what's known as the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road. China, along with 135 nations who have signed on to this thing, have built more infrastructure than the world has combined in the last 100 years, just through the last decade. About 1 billion people, lost it. Hello, there we go. About 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty through these large-scale infrastructure projects. National banks have been kept not privatized to issue large-scale credit for major, I mean, we're talking 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail built up in only 15 years, where Canada has 0, first world country. China did 40,000 and they're gonna double that. They have maglev rail. So you got a very different way of thinking about planning for the future than anything that we've been used to in the past at least 3 generations. So that's a challenge. And now you got 152 nations saying that they're going to be a part coming at the Kazan summit, the BRICS summit coming up in October. 152 countries said that they are going to sign on to the alternative payment and financing mechanism outside of the SWIFT, the US controlled SWIFT payment system. So that's, again, you can imagine if you're a geopolitical sociopath, that would probably cause you to stay up at night, thinking, how do we sabotage this? Not just that, you have something called the North-South Transportation Route. That's also growing. It was signed 20 years ago, but it's been moving fast in the past 3 years with rail lines, multimodal systems going from St. Petersburg, actually deeper up into the Arctic, which is also opening up what's known as the Polar Silk Road. all the way down to India through Iran, down through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia. That's a major route which some people chose to frame as a rival to the New Silk Road East-West corridor, but it's actually very synergistic. They're part of the same thing. In the Middle East, you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Iran, all members of the BRICS Plus now, Ethiopia. You have now a burst of large-scale infrastructure and a defense of sovereign nation states as the basis of world law. The idea is whether or not we have a rules-based order with an oligarchical elite of unelected bureaucrats imposing their will onto the masses, or that you have sovereign nation states activating as the basis of authority of law. And the effects of that, as we see in the discussions across Africa, is building things like the Africa Agenda 2063 plan for 6 different east-west rail grids and 3 north-south rail grids, with the most primary one already being built up across the Sahel, stretching from the Red Sea all the way to the Atlantic. And Saudi Arabia as well has completely shifted its trajectory from being a tool of the West, financing ISIS and other Islamic terrorist groups, into being something that actually cares about developing its people and developing a basis of survival through large-scale high-speed rail all the way across the Arabian Desert. And just quick something else to put together by the Schiller Institute, published by the Cradle, is a vision of the Bashar al-Assad 5 Cs vision, which is right before the Arab Spring was launched. Bashar al-Assad had gone on a massive campaign around the world where he got 17 nations to sign on to support the building up of rail lines connecting all the main water systems, with Damascus as the center of this major development zone based on win-win cooperation. So it's a different philosophy. And we are going to get a new system, but the question is that system going to be based upon divide and conquer, making people depopulated, dumber, fighting each other, living in scarcity, or is it going to be based upon some concern and regard for the sacredness of human life, whereby we are making life better for our children together through things that we don't have to, through a logic that says we don't have to steal from somebody else to get something for ourselves. How revolutionary is that? Should be common sense, but it's not. Some of the characters of the BRICS, representing the BRICS nations, and they all have deep states. I'm not trying to say anybody here is an angel or anything, but you have deep states everywhere, but they have done a better job battling the deep state structures built up in those countries than we have in the West. Another element just to keep in mind, I mentioned already the logic of the dangers of the terrain of the current situation. And we have obviously a certain outlook amongst certain factions that have taken power over the dead body of Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the other side of the PLO. So Yitzhak Rabin, who was the Israeli prime minister, murdered in 1995. Him and his counterpart, Yasser Arafat, were working on a 2-state solution based on the actualization of that which was agreed upon in 1947 to create a state of Palestine and a state of Israel together side by side, built on economic development on both sides. Because that works, Yitzhak had to be murdered. His allies were increasingly purged, and you had this Anglo-Zionist, takeover of U.S. foreign policy that brought in things like 9/11, and that brought in what was known as a doctrine of Greater Israel, or what Richard Pearl drafted for Benjamin Netanyahu in 1997 as clean break, a strategy for securing the realm, which people can read. Cynthia wrote a lot about this. And it basically calls for how to overthrow a new regime change on an array of governments around Israel, starting or ending with Iran. But that Syria obviously was also in the chopping block, as was Gaddafi's Libya. So some of that did happen, and the ideology is still very much there among people like Smotrich and others. That's actually a little emblem on an active IDL badge right now that's tied to the Irgun militia terrorist cell that set up over 60 years ago by people like Jabotinsky, which features a much bigger diagram of Israel than anything we're used to seeing today. And the idea is if we can get an excuse to just purge the land of those Arabs living there, then we can create some sort of or actualize a covenant made thousands of years ago. And people are willing to blow up the world to make this happen. There are things called the Samson Doctrine, which is a real defense doctrine amongst certain factions within the Zionist clan that has taken over control of Israel currently. You also see these weird things too, like that's not a heifer. That may not be a heifer, and it's true. That's true. But I picked it out more for the title than I did for the picture. But you do have currently 4 genetically modified red heifers with not a single non-red hair on their bodies that's been imported from Texas in Israel, waiting to be sacrificed as part of some weird ritual to usher in the rebuilding of Solomon's temple. That's actually a thing. They didn't want to wait for these things to be born naturally. They had to GMO them. But there's a quality of very toxic thinking active with access to a lot of weapons, including nuclear. So where's all of these things coming from? What's behind this? Because there are Gordian knots, and I know that there are people, adults in the room, amongst the Russians, amongst the Chinese, amongst other nations who are trying to not get caught into an eye for an eye trap. You know, Israel's going attacking Lebanon. There's some of the most abrasive acts of terrorism that we've seen with pagers blowing up, killing children, some of the biggest bombs that Israel has ever launched, just launched this week. We have obviously efforts to try to pick a fight with Iran as well as Syria now. And then you have obviously some weird overlap with a place called Ukraine. Pardon me? No such a thing? As?
Ukraine.
Oh, that's a whole controversial discussion to have. We're not. But we have that zone being lit up right now. Certain people would like to use it as a proxy to initiate some form of confrontation with Russia. It does smell a little apocalyptic. So we got to really know what is going on and what type of thinking is needed to navigate through this. There's a lot of mystery around a certain domain, a kingdom called Khazaria. Who has not heard of Khazaria before? Okay, about half. Khazaria is a place where there's a lot of discussion right now around getting people to, because Israel's obviously behaving very terribly, or at least those representing Israel, to really get a sense that there's a Khazarian mafia out to destroy the world. That's actually a thing that's out there to the zeitgeist. Because this is an image of a kingdom that existed as a Jewish kingdom in a region that overlaps today's Ukraine, a lot of Central Asia, and some of Russia and around the Caspian, that lasted for several hundred years. Very little has survived. There are some letters that have survived, found in some attic of an old synagogue, the Genitza scrolls. There's some references from Islamic scholars and geographers who lived during that time that gives us a certain insight into what this is. But there's a lot of confusion in the current day about what exactly was Khazaria and how that plays into the current situation today. And as I mentioned, when you look at the BRICS leaders, what's fascinating about this is it represents, and also the active policy, is these represent ancient civilizational forces that seem to have a lot in difference with each other, but they're finding a point of common humanity to organize themselves around. Islam, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist. You've got a whole variety of different cultures that are recognizing a more human way of behaving as neighbors instead of the neocon clash of civilizations. We have to fight our neighbor if they give a different word to God than we do. So I'm going to use this as my jump off point to properly understand what are the Templars, what are these secret societies, and how does that also affect the current day, which Cynthia will pick up on in her presentation. To understand the meaning of the Silk Road today, the new Silk Road, we have to look at the last Silk Road, because this is something which has been sort of shaping more of our world history than most people, especially those living in the West, fully realize. About over 2,000 years ago, in 200 BC, the Han Dynasty came to power in United China for the first time. And with that came a different philosophy than the Warring States period that had existed for hundreds of years before that, of just eye for an eye, Hobbesianism forever amongst various warlords of China. Now, with that came the idea of commerce as the basis of diplomacy, as the basis of living, making life better with our neighbors and for our future. So there's a deep Confucian philosophy around respect for the grandparents and those who sacrifice to give us what we have, and respect for our grandkids and those who've not even been born yet. That's a deep concept that animated the rise of the Silk Road. Now that idea is going to be important to hold in mind to also appreciate Khazaria, as well as how something very beautiful came undone in about 1,000 years ago. So the world in which the Silk Road emerged, 200 BC, right? That was Rome also living at that same time, slipping slowly into empire. because this is something that went right from China all the way to Europe through the Middle East, through the Sassanid Empire, the pre-Muslim empire, and it was really very much based on mutual dialogue, sharing of ideas and discoveries. It wasn't just silk and spices, but it was also poetry. It was also methods of thinking about science. Pardon? Medicine, big time. Astronomy, astronomical discoveries. So Rome was also at that time a different character than the empire that came to do so much damage to the world. At the time, this is right before the first of the three Punic Wars against Carthage. So Rome was literally a much smaller thing. It still had a certain republican integrity to it. It did not embrace the idea that it has to become a global hegemon under a priesthood. That hadn't happened yet. And you had an alliance for about 250 years with Carthage of North Africa, some of Spain, and they held it together against things like the Persian Empire and other combats for a very long time, until one day something happened that shifted the character of the Roman elites, and they decided they could stab Carthage in the back and get their stuff. And you had the first Punic War, followed by two more that completely ended with Carthage delenda est, right? Carthage must be destroyed. At that point, no man, woman, women were allowed to survive as long as they were brought into slavery, but children, any type of young men who might have a memory of their fathers being murdered and might want revenge had to be murdered. So it was a slaughterhouse, and Rome really lost its soul. And we can see the slide from republic into empire during this very tumultuous period that oversaw the murder of people like Cicero, who was trying to resist that slide into tyranny. I know that there's a lot of bad things said about Cicero, but I've read his works, and I got to say, he fought to keep this thing from happening. And at its largest expanse, we have Rome here occupying a vast seat of territory. It was really, all roads really did lead to Rome. Let's jump up to a slightly more present moment. Because what was allowing this to happen? What was spreading? What was behind the transformation of Rome from a republic into an empire that lost its soul? What was behind the transformation of the United States today from the Republican ideas of Abraham Lincoln into the thing that increasingly took over and transformed it into an empire, especially over the dead bodies of FDR and JFK? Because that thing that Albert Pike was a part of is tied to what we're seeing here. There's a figure who is an underappreciated but very dangerous mind from the Plymouth Brethren, which was a sect that created a new variation of Christianity that hadn't really been seen before, around an idea of a secret rapture. One of the guys who oversaw this was a fellow named John Nelson Darby. He's a high-level British intelligence operative, and he founded a sect, or was part of a sect, called the Exclusive Plymouth Brethren. A lot of Satanists came out of this sect, including Aleister Crowley. And it was a sect that appears to have a very nice outward doctrine and an internal doctrine that was very different from the public teaching. But when you read the writings of people like George Hawkins Pember in his book, The Antichrist Babylon and the Coming of the Kingdom, you can get an appreciation for this dual teaching of the Plymouth Brethren. Again, this guy was a very high-level British strategist. And he makes the point, looking upon the ancient pre-Christian world, that the great ancient religion, applying only one, distributed over the whole world, seems to have originated in Chaldea, where it was probably revealed and established by those fallen angels who, after the deluge, consorted with the daughters of men. He's also the promoter and the founder of the Nephilim interpretation that's been really latched onto by the UFO groups today. That actually finds that origin in this guy's writings. The general plan of the mysteries, he's describing here something known as mystery cults, was a masterly organization admirably adapted for the carrying out of one obvious aim, namely to bring the whole world into bondage to the powers which directed the higher rites and teachings. They were divided into the lesser and the greater, and those appear to have been absolutely distinct. The one affording no more than the exoteric teaching, but the other, the esoteric, or the real secrets of the mysteries, called the aporete. Initiates of the lesser were termed the mystei, those of the greater, the ephori, or epopte. So he's talking here about something which is like secret society 101. You got to recognize that no secret society ever works by putting out what it's going to do openly, right? Because what it's going to do and why it's going to do it is going to be so unnatural and disgusting that no natural human being would ever allow or go along with something so unnatural and disgusting. So you have to use an exoteric outward teaching that might seem nice and fluffy, like light and life or whatever, right? Something very innocuously like nice, but then have within it, for those initiates who've qualified themselves to really know the secret teachings, the truth. So there's two different books, right? And that's at the heart of what we're going to look at. Because the ancient world, the entire pre-Christian world, was very much animated by this universal religion. It had different flavors in different parts of the world, different cultures that it had adapted to geographically, different names given to the same. Venus had several names, right? Apollo had several names, but it was the same thing with the exact same techniques of controlling and influencing systems of people and culture. And most importantly, myths, sacred myths that the people who would be molded would have to believe in for a high priesthood to manage said myths. That's just part of the recipe book. So here's just several images of one thing. On the right-hand side are solar deities. What you have there is the Persian myth, actually that's the Helios, which was both in Persia, but also was imported into Rome during the Second Punic War. You've got the Babylonian Marduk, another solar deity fighting a nemesis. You have Egypt's Horus over here, the Eye of Horus. That's the famous thing people are used to seeing maybe on the, any Illuminati symbolism or something. That's the eye of the pyramid is Horus, the son of Isis. You have here Lucifer, another fallen morning star, another solar deity that fell, and Apollo, that's active both in the Greek and Roman mystery cults. On the left, anybody know who that guy is? Actually, generic looking Roman emperor is not easy to distinguish, but that's actually Julian the Apostate. He was only around for about 360, or from 360 to 363, but he distinguished himself as being the last of the pagan Helios man gods, the guy who wanted to revive the old, the system of the Roman Empire emperor cult, that the emperor is more than a man, that he is a solar deity unto himself, around which all of the other subcults active in the empire had to receive license. So he did this in a way which also involved the attempted reconstruction of Solomon's temple, which had been last destroyed in 70 AD in the Jewish-Roman wars. So that was something he did to try to manipulate the Jews against the Christians, as has always been the case. At the better times, Jews and Christians were working together against the cults, and we have examples of that, as the case with Rabbi Philo of Alexandria, working with Peter in Rome against the mystery cults of Simon the Magician. But much of the time, unfortunately, people who had everything in common to work together were often set at each other's throats by these types of manipulations. All right, so some of the core concerns of the early Christians involved the dominant cults of Rome that included, but we're not limited to, but I would say the dominant three were primarily the cult of Cybele Attis, the cult of Mithra, and the cult of Isis. This is a small little image from a certain collector's website just showcasing Cybele, Isis, and Mithra, the mystery cult religion in ancient Rome. And it says cult singular. Some people treat them like they were three separate things. It's true that they had three separate characteristics, but they were one thing. So they were being very truthful to use that language of recognizing the unity of these things. I'm just going to quickly say a word about each one. So the first one, the cult of Cybele Attis, was one of the mystery religions. This one is being revived again today. It has been revived, actually. It never went away, but it's really being revived in a big way with the creation of something known as the Fabian Society in the 19th century. This is going to be part of a book that's coming out soon. Cybele is a Magna Mater earth deity, an earth goddess, also known as Gaia in some cultures, also known as Demeter in other cultures. In Greece, for example, people would worship Cybele through the mysteries of Eleusis, which was overseen by Demeter, the harvest goddess. Part of the rituals that are again being revived today by people like Joe Rogan and others involve the utilization of psychotropic drugs, especially drugs that came from plants, especially wheat, that had when certain funguses emerge. It's been discovered, and it's been known for a long time, but they've been developing this by MKUltra, can create things like LSD-25. But even though they've been enhancing it scientifically, it's been used for thousands of years as part of mystery rituals to just depattern the mind as part of a broader process of forming those who go through degrees of initiation ceremonies. Another aspect of this involves a counterpart named Attis, who's a male counterpart. Those would be members of this sect, which was brought into Rome in the end of the Punic War as part of an arrangement made by the cult of Delphi to guarantee victory over Hannibal. So one of the conditions somehow was if you bring in the cult of Mithra and sanction it, or cult of Cybele and sanction it, you will beat Carthage. They did. Carthage was defeated. Who knows what the real reasons were for Carthage's defeat? But if you wanted to be a male member of the church, and especially like a hierophant, you had to basically cut off your genitalia as part of your sacred ceremony. You do this in generally euphoric, out-of-body state, helped with a bit of drugs. It involves rituals that involve sacred orgies, very, very, very explicit things, and I believe also probably, well, not probably, definitely animal mutilation and murder, and probably other things that were not just simply animals. So that was a big deal. And after about a generation, the Roman families were pissed off that so many of the young men were cutting off their genitalia that they basically organized to kick the cult out, which didn't exactly happen. It did work for about a century to make it go underground, but it came back with a vengeance with Caligula and never really went away until Stilicho. The cult of Mithra was another one. This is a warrior cult, male only in Rome. If you were a Praetorian Guard or a member of the elite Roman legions, you had to be a member of Mithra, the cult of Mithra. And that's the same Phrygian hat that Attis is wearing, both imported from Anatolia and Persia. Both involving what's called the Toraborium, the murdering of the bull, and both of them involving day-night ceremonies. As we see here, Mithra, looking over at Helios on the left, the solar deity, is also overseen by, I believe it's Venus, but I'm forgetting, a lunar deity, Demeter, representing a lunar deity, representing two different ways of worshiping, with the idea of being a stoic Apollonian, doing your duty in the day, and letting it all loose at night. Much like a lot of young people have been induced to do in our current sick culture, where you're just sort of like, you hate your job, you do the grind, and then you let loose on Friday night at a rave and just let the beast out, right? Be free, and then do it all over again in a cycle. Great way to just keep people out of equilibrium with their true selves. And this is just a part of the way the system worked. But again, this one was a male-only one, and usually what you find is that when you look at the geography of those 400 Mithraic temples that are all worshipped underground, representing sort of a womb of Gaia, that's where all of these things called the Mithraeum were all underground temples. They're always, or at least in a statistically high number of cases, right below a temple of Cybele and Attis. So usually a family would go together and worship on a Sunday service or whatever, and the girls would go into the temple of Cybele and Attis, and the men would go towards the temple of Mithra, and then they would meet back and, I guess, just not look at each other in the eyes or something for a little while and do it all over again next week. The third one, very important, is the cult of Isis and Serapis, another mystery cult. Each of them appear to have about 8 degrees of initiation, but there might be more beyond that. Everyone in society was expected to be an initiate of the first degree, which is basically like everybody should be a hedonist as their fundamental identity. At that point, you could pick from those who have talent, who deserve to maybe be given a chance to go into an inner club. And from there, you can maybe find talent who's able to maybe be tested to maybe qualify for the next inner club. But it was really just basically brainwashing, in my opinion. This one was also imported during or right after the Second Punic War as an arrangement between the cults, the priesthood of Egypt and Rome. It was brought in from Egypt and given a certain Roman character. Serapis was added, the god of the dead. And the cult of Isis. Isis, another, was again, as we said, a goddess of navigation. It involves Pythian priestesses, who many generals, kings would come from far and wide to these various oracles. They'd pay a lot of money to get to know, what do the gods want them to do? Do we go to war? Do we make peace arrangements with its neighbor? What do we do? So there was a lot of power and a lot of political intelligence information was gathered. And because there was a lot of money also spent, there was a lot of banking capabilities to provide loans on conditionality to various people who want who want to know what the gods want them to do. It's not cheap to get to know what the gods want you to do. Now, the thing about this is that, and this is a little etching from about a century ago, is that these priestesses were prolifically also doped up on a variety of narcotics. And those who were interpreting what this doped up girl was saying, because it was unintelligible, were an initiated class of priests who would then tell the king or general when to go to war. So this is kind of like if you imagine how intelligence operations work today. It's not that different as far as being able to use information, shape perceptions to get people to destroy themselves. Big part of the global cult. So this thing started wearing itself pretty thin and spreading itself very thin, getting a little top heavy and immoral. And at a certain point, the empire was losing its ability to exist. You can only rape and pillage and steal from the colonies to a certain point while making your inner capital people decadent through bread and circuses to the point that the thing doesn't know how to maintain itself. Not that different from the accelerated collapse that's a result of being or tolerating, in my mind, being in a consumer society for too long, right? You can only not produce and live like a consumer identity while gambling instead of doing real economy to a certain point, after which you forget how you used to do things. How did you build your infrastructure? If you lose that living knowledge, you're in big trouble. So that's sort of the type of process on a more expanded scale that Rome went through. And there was a fight. Within this, there were things like mystery cults. The Council of Nicaea was one of several attempts, overall a good one that involved some compromises, but overall did codify things like the Nicene Creed as a non-negotiable text around the idea that, okay, even though we have many different cults calling themselves Christian, each with their own take on what it means, some of them representing the secret books of John, some representing the secret gospels of Mary Magdalene, a lot of secret gospels of people who said they've got secret teachings from Jesus, and they wrote their own things, but that were ultimately just Isis, Cybele mystery cults in disguise, all utilizing rites of initiation. This was getting messy, very messy. And at a certain point, there was a battle, and the Nicene Creed put out a certain set of principles that, if you want to be a Christian, you have to sort of agree to these things. There's one God, it's a reasonable God. Jesus Christ is God embodied in the flesh, died for the sins, certain concepts that you're just non-negotiable. Now, I don't think it was nearly enough. You had people like St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, who did a good job trying to fight the residues of the mystery cults that were banned. But it wasn't enough. I think there was too much damage done. And though they tried to split up the empire to kind of keep it alive, the Western Empire went spiraling downhill faster and faster. And within a very short period of time, you have the mess, the shit show that became what was once the Roman Empire I guess you could call it the Roman Warring States period of just Franks and Ostrogoths and Visigoths, every little warlord taking their little chunk of territory, right? And pretty much being in forever wars with their neighbors. Most of them were all pagan. A lot of them had Nordic Viking belief structures. Most of them in different ways had human sacrifice involved. One of them stands out though, and that's known as the Merovingians, aka what became the Franks, today's Franks. They were known at the time as the Sorcerer Kings, the pagan Sorcerer Kings. A couple of generations down, you had a guy named Clovis. He decides, okay, I'll go and call myself a Christian for political expediency reasons. No evidence that he really made the switch, but he still kept the title of Sorcerer King. This thing lasted for a little while, and it did consolidate most of the power under a centralized authority. And I guess I'll take it this way. It didn't last long. Something got pulled out from under the rug, or a rug got pulled out from under the feet of the Merovingians at a certain point by the grandfather of Charlemagne, who's going to come up more in this story in a second. But as I said, we're not going to stick to one geography for too long. We're going to do some bouncing around. I know it's uncomfortable, but it's an important component of this type of analysis. The same time that this is going on, you have something called the Göktürk Empire, originating in Mongolia. We don't really know a lot about the details of this civilization, but it spread very quickly, rapidly, from 570 until the early 640s. Didn't last long, but at its peak, this is basically the image of the Göktürks at their peak. It overlaid a lot of China and all the way through Central Asia to today's Ukraine on the easternmost side. One thing we do know about this is during this period, you had the reactivation of the Han Dynasty Silk Road. So when the Han Dynasty collapsed in 200 AD, the Silk Road collapsed with it. All of the trade routes from east to west melted down. Rome went into a warring states period. China collapsed at that same time for 400 years into chaos. And it was only around this period that you started getting a revival of intercivilizational dialogue once again through trade and commerce and sharing of technology and science and poetry. So that was revived through this type of unified front. But again, it was created by various, it wasn't a unified government in the sense because it had still tribal leaders and stuff. And it was ultimately weak and fast. There were certain battles with various Chinese leaders at different times. And it had to break, just like the Roman Empire, to keep itself alive into an Eastern and a Western front. The Eastern one collapsed in 630. The Western one lingered out a little bit longer until about 642, but ultimately it too went down. But the Silk Road was given new breath again by the Tang Dynasty, set up in 618. So the Tang Dynasty manages to come together, unify the state again for the first time since the Han Dynasty, and revives Confucian principles, massive anti-corruption, judicial reforms, and I'm going to say a word about that very shortly. But it allows for the extension now of some harmonious collective action and decision-making into a geographical zone that Asia had not seen up until that point. And with that comes the revival of the Silk Road once more. So starting in around 640, now you have the Silk Road revived once more. It was assisted by the Gokturks, but now the Tang Dynasty really takes it off. And at the same time, as this is being revived, going through the newly emerging Muslim world, right? Islam had just sort of bursted onto the scene very, very quickly around 640, 650. Now, all of a sudden, you have also the north-south transportation corridors. So remember what I was saying earlier at the very beginning, the east-west current rail grids and development corridors, and the north-south transportation corridor for, say, Petersburg down to India. This represents something that has a historical continuity to it. It's not in a vacuum, as most analysts or people try to locate it with no context. So these are two of the major arteries of the north-south Volga River Silk Road that did go down through the Black Sea. Ukraine plays a role in this thing, or what becomes Ukraine later on as a name. Khazaria is that zone, and it goes all the way down into Persia, really. So very big expansions of what the world is for people living in these little peasant communities, right? It's a very big thing when all of a sudden something like this happens. And the world gets, your place of imagination of what other humans are, what reality is, expands, or in a way that oligarchs don't tend to like it. Oligarchs want us to have very little imaginations, very little physical mobility, so that we're easier to divide, control, and keep, self-controlling, really. Whether it's 15-minute cities or whatever, it's always been the case of feudalists wanting to keep people in a very fixed domain. So again, let's return to Khazaria, the Jewish kingdom, or the easternmost part of the Gokturk Empire that didn't collapse. That was the only thing that hung on. And why is it that in a certain era period of high potential in 750, Khazaria decided to basically accept Judaism as their national sort of religion? But it wasn't even just that, because it was, here, I'm going to say something about this. This is interesting. The major leaders of the world at this time who were activating the Silk Road involved Charlemagne, the grandson of Charles Martel, the mayor of Paris, who pulled the rug, as I mentioned, from under the feet of the Merovingians. That guy, Charles Martel, was the grandfather of Charlemagne. His father was Pepin the Short. It's a terrible name, but he was a great guy. And he also combated the sorcerer kings quite well and did massive judicial and cultural reforms in a way that a lot of people don't fully appreciate. And Charlemagne probably took this to its peak. Next to him is Harun al-Mamun, the father of Harun al-Rashid, the head of the Abbasid dynasty of the Islamic world. Very big hat, as you pointed out. Yes, very noble hat. Another massive reformer. At this point, the Umayyad dynasty, that was the first Muslim dynasty, had been pushed out by the Abbasids. They went to Spain. So you had two Muslim dynasties coexisting at this time. The Abbasids worked very closely with Charlemagne, and there's an important story in that I'm going to get at. This is the Taizong Emperor who was overseeing the revival of the Silk Road. And right over there is King Bulan, somebody we don't know too much about, but he was the figure who in 750 converted to Judaism, was the king of Khazaria. Now, Khazaria was also known by scholars to have been, or not Khazaria, sorry, the Khazars, before they went Jewish, were very much in tune with Confucian principles. The idea of the mandate of heaven, the idea of judging man's law based on the laws of heaven, was active largely because of the interconnection with China that had been made a century earlier. The Chinese emperor was still called the heavenly Kagan by the Khazars up until 750 or so. So what do we know about this very anomalous state? Well, according to Abu al-Istakar, who was a Persian historian of the 10th century, he makes the point that it wasn't an ethno-state, that the king of Khazaria has 7 judges that make all laws. And basically, he says that they were taken from the Jews, Christians, Muslims, and idolaters, the pagans. When the people have a lawsuit, it is they who judge it. The parties do not approach the king himself, but only these judges. Now, of the 7, there were 2 Jews, 2 Christians, 2 Muslims, and 1 Sikh for a pagan. And that was a very ecumenical approach to law. The other anomaly is that militarily, they had no military. They actually had an arrangement with the Abbasid dynasty to have 10,000 Muslim soldiers as the standing army in Khazaria. Right? So actually, they were defended by Muslims, and only on the one condition that if Khazaria would ever engage in a war with a Muslim state, then those soldiers would turn on Khazaria. So it's a very interesting agreement. It's hard to even imagine something similar like that with Israel being defended by Muslim soldiers on certain conditions like that. I mean, it's the outside the box thinking is hard for modern society to wrap its mind around, but it was very creative. Trade, it was a keynote on the Silk Roads, east, west, and north, south. Diplomacy, they were the ones who arranged the embassies for peace and business deals all across the Silk Road that were key in getting Muslims and Christians and Chinese and others to work together. Within Charlemagne's kingdom, this is called the Carolingians. By the way, the Merovingians who got ousted by his grandfather, I don't think that they ever forgave the Carolingians for this ultimately. And there is a belief that is active in weird circles amongst the Black nobility today that the leading noble families of Europe, like the royalties, somehow have little bits of Jesus's blood because of the thesis that they believe in. And I'm not saying I believe this, I'm just saying this is a belief that's out there that has influence, that Jesus didn't die according to the Gnostic Gospels, but that rather Mary Magdalene, his sort of sacred whore, as they call it, lived out their days in southern France and gave birth to Jesus's babies, who were protected by the Priory of Zion and who have continued to promulgate through various noble bloodlines, which justify their right to be born into situations of masterhood over the slaves of society. That's a belief that's out there. It may be nutty, but the Merovingians believed that they were told that they were the ones who had this sacred blood. So Charlemagne had a very different idea. Again, he had a region here in the south that his father took from the Umayyads called Septimania. It involved a king that was invited in from the house of David from Baghdad, called Abu al-Maktir. And you had a Spanish viscount, a Muslim viscount, and what do you call it? And a Christian leader as well, who would be as a trifold leadership of Septimania. That's a very interesting way of doing things. Up there is a picture of the Carolingian kingdom a couple of generations after Charlemagne dies, which unfortunately had begun to break down into different geopolitical zones claimed by his 3 children, who were getting very bad advice from the Vatican and from some Venetian advisors on basically how to kill your brother 101. And right here in the middle is the kingdom of Lothair, the youngest son, who really got a bad deal because both Charles and Louis were induced to sign the Treaty of Narbonne that involved them agreeing to fight up and gang up on each other anytime there's a conflict with their brother, that they would fight their brother. So all of the conflicts, if people wonder where do the borders of European countries come from, right? What's the origin? Why is France France? Why does France have a weird relationship with Germany, right? How are these things always poked through the 30 Years' War, World War I, World War II, where little geographical locations, right, are fought over and millions die over who's going to own Alsace-Lorraine? You can't understand really those psychodynamics and how the oligarchy plays it without understanding this type of sabotage here that created generations of eye for an eye of revanchism. Here's a picture of an embassy sent to Harun al-Rashid from Charlemagne when Pope Stephen III, who was a very vicious pope, trying to revive basically the system of the Roman Empire with the God-man pope at the top, managing the worldly and heavenly kingdoms together. Stephen was known as an ultramontanist in that sense and had tried to organize a crusade in around 800. Actually, he was already trying that earlier. And Charlemagne kept on avoiding the discussion and really trying to bypass that. But at one point, it comes close. And it was through a Jewish embassy that a peace deal is arranged whereby Charlemagne sends his, I believe, cousin down as an envoy to speak with Harun al-Rashid, who says, okay, we'll tell you what, rather than us fighting each other over the Holy Land, how about we just give you the Holy Land? We'll give you Jerusalem. Here's the deed. And he sends the whole Christian embassy all the way back to Charlemagne with the deed and a giant elephant and gold and all sorts of gifts, as well as like a little, thank you, nice to make your acquaintance. And we'll guard it. So it's yours, but we will guard it. And the fuse, the detonator is taken out of the bomb and the crusade is avoided. Charlemagne loves this elephant. It's actually something you can read on Wikipedia. He rides this thing for like 20 years. He loves the elephant so much. But he's always trying to work through avoiding falling into these traps. I think in the same way that you have many leaders today trying to avoid falling into the trap being set for them, that will unleash a chain reaction of hell for our coming generations if smaller minds prevail. So I mentioned something very quickly here about the Renaissance dynamic. Not only, so just a quick fact sheet for each of the three Renaissance domains: Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Chinese. We don't know, again, most of the records have been destroyed over centuries about Khazaria, so we have little to infer from, except the effects. One thing that the effects demonstrate is that when you look at the Carolingian domain, during this time you had what's known as the Carolingian Renaissance, meaning, as I wrote here, you have measurably vast roads, bridges over the Rhine, canals, cathedrals, schools, vast financial reforms, that saw the private financiers lose control as Charlemagne's government took control of coinage and credit. So you had a lot of feudal barons trying to claim control of basically their human cows, and also all influence over their local, it's like little gangs in New York, right? Everybody wants full freedom to just have the vice or express the vices that they want to express without having any higher law of morality imposed itself. And that was the law of the land. So he went to war with these gangs. You had a monastery reform. So basically, he forced the monks to say, okay, if you want to be a monk, you got to be productive. You got to till the soil. You got to work. You got to produce. You can't just be a leech off of the labor of actual people. He applied very vociferously the doctrine of witness of St. Augustine. So there have been a lot of efforts to try to get Jewish-Christian wars even in this day. And basically, Augustine put forth a legal argument in 390 or so, which Augustine was also trying to avoid these clash of civilizations, Christian, Jewish, Christian, well, at the time it wasn't Muslim. But the point there was, okay, well, based on the idea that the Jews, Christian and Jews alike believe that they all came from Abraham, we can all agree on that. And thus, their existence is that they witness, their existence confirms the importance of Christianity. And so we shouldn't kill the Jews. We should actually, it's our obligation to protect them. Now, that might have sounded a little untasteful to the ear or a little condescending to Jewish people, but it saved millions of lives. There's a similar policy that I'm going to talk about here in the Abbasids in the Muslim world of the doctrine of dhimmi. Again, same idea. The doctrine of dhimmi is essentially the idea of St. Augustine, but applied to the Muslim world, where the Muslims said, well, we have to protect the Jews. We have to avoid falling into traps of killing them and getting into eye for an eye. And that also kept the peace for many centuries. As I wrote here, under the humanist leadership of Caliph al-Mahdi, the son of Harun al-Rashid and grandson of al-Mamun, networks of humanist education centers were created that were called houses of wisdom, which brought Muslims, Christians, and Jewish scholars together to translate ancient works of Greek and Latin. They would study astronomy, literature, medicine, and engineering. Paper mills were established in 832 in Samarkand, Cairo, Damas, and Baghdad, and technologies originating in China were applied to broaden humanity's knowledge. And again, these were peppered all across the Arabic world. It was really quite something. And finally, a word on China, that during the 300 years of the Tang Dynasty rule, the arts rose to new heights, and the poet-statesman became the actualized ideal, as the greatest poets and painters, such as Wang Wei, Li Bai, and Du Fu, played a major role in political figures. Torture and death penalties were nearly done away with, and public schools were built at record numbers. And also, it was a sanctuary for various persecuted peoples to provide to who just came and lived out their days in China, were granted lands. Like, for example, actually, one thing that's also of note is that the reason why you have Muslims even living in China has a lot to do with the fact that in the Tang Dynasty, early on, what almost sabotaged the Silk Road in around I want to say 690 something, was a civil war called the Sheng Rebellion, or Lushan Rebellion. And this was a general who wanted to become emperor and wanted to launch a civil war. And basically, the only thing that kept China from collapsing back into the Warring States period again was that the Abbasid dynasty under Harun al-Mamun's father sent 5,000 Muslim soldiers to defend the Chinese, and they were rewarded for their efforts by being granted free land in Western China. So why did this come undone? And this is where it gets very important to be aware of the current of mystery cults, because the mystery cults are there the whole time. They maybe rebranded themselves under sometimes Christian garb, but we're always maintaining an esoteric inner doctrine and keeping the rituals alive, waiting to subvert the good every way that they can. One of the key locations, or two locations, where a lot of the Roman patrician families went after Rome collapsed on the Western Front was Amalfi and Venice. Cynthia's going to say a bit more about that later. Venice became a hub that soon became the Second Roman Empire. Venice leads an anti-Jewish purge. So basically, we see a wave around Europe, starting with Venice, of anti-Jewish laws, whereby in Venice, no boat is allowed to carry a Jew coming from Asia. You're not allowed to be a member of a guild, have a trade, even work the farm if you're a Jew. All of a sudden, these strange laws, the Aziz laws in England also does the same thing. And so you have a pigeonholing of the Jews into a very limited array of options, basically selling used cloth or going into money lending. Kind of like the days of the Roman Empire, when the Roman Empire would use certain Jews to carry out the dirty work, to be the financial mercenaries, whether it was the tax collectors that everybody hated, or to do the dirty work for the Lord or for the emperor, the priest god, that would involve passing out usurious loans, that would involve getting a lot of hate feedback, right? And whenever the angry peasants who were tired of getting burned by financial warfare would come out with pitchforks and torches, there would always be that court Jew to be thrown under the bus and be given to the angry mobs. That's sort of a weird arrangement that's been made for a long time, but that happened again. Venice oversteered this rebirth of this model. And you had what's known as the ghettos. That's actually a Venetian word that came first out of Venice, where the ghetto systems, where they were only allowed to live in certain areas or walk out of certain areas in daylight if they had a license by a lord or another lord within the Venetian aristocracy. And this again spread. It makes what's going on in Gaza more than a little ironic, obviously. So the Crusades were launched. And here I'm going to start winding down here and making way for Cynthia. We're going to have a little bit of overlap, but the sabotage of potential is really important to be aware of when we're looking at this history, because we're living in history now. People are going to be looking down at us from the future, wondering what happened, right? How did people fail to be the better selves that they could have been when there was so much potential for good? Or how did they actually overcome their tragic impulses and become wiser and navigate through the storm when they could have fallen, as so many had before? So it's important to situate these lessons as something that allows us to not make the same mistakes. Because what sabotaged it? Well, even though Charlemagne held back on the Crusades, they were finally successful. And it did involve a lot of assassinations. And in 1096, you did have the First Crusade launched. And there were several more in the wake of the First Crusade that based itself on the idea that Christians were no longer supposed to be all around like peace and forgiveness and turning your cheek and loving your neighbor, but rather no, we're going to have now warrior Christian knights, warrior monks, in the form of several different orders that would now do Jesus's bidding by killing infidels. That didn't work well, but it did leave a lot of blood in its wake. And as just a point of timeline here, you have the Templars founded in 1199. So here's an example of just some of the directives of where the various crusades were launched. There were, in this list, about 7, but the biggest one was the 4th. And overall, this here is a little pink mapping of an area known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Again, a fight over the Holy Land, but also, not just that, it was based upon, there's a better rendition of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its largest peak. Looks kind of similar, actually, to a certain other location we see today, right? That's the official flag of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it itself was formed in the wake of the First Crusade in 1099 from a territory in Palestine wrested from the Muslims by European Christians. And they maintained it in some form or another until 1291. Now, there's several key orders that were active, knighthoods that had a Gnostic mystery cult aspect to it. One of them is known as the Knights Templar, that was set up in 1118. Its official name were the Poor Knights of the Order of Solomon's Temple. It was devoted, not only was their headquarters in Mount Moriah, might have been a tip of Tolkien might have been tipping his hat to something evil going on. But that's where you had the supposed existence of the site of Solomon's first temple. This is where the Dome on the Rock sits today. This is what certain people want to blow up to build Solomon's temple again after they kill these 4 red heifers. In some weird cataclysmic actualization of prophecy. It's weird. But that was their base, in the caves of Solomon's mines. And that's where they carried out as their headquarters. They were working very closely with another strange knighthood I'm going to talk about, but they were constituted as an order by Bernard de Clairvaux, who was a grand strategist who put 2 popes on the throne, who oversaw the Second Crusade and made the charter for the Templars. One thing about the charter is that it was very liberal on the idea that any Templar could join another religion as long as it furthered the cause. What did that mean exactly? It's not very clearly defined in the charter, but it does smell of something that the Jesuits honed later on as an ability to be chameleons, to basically jump into any skin suit you could as long as it advanced a certain agenda, that only some were allowed to know what that agenda was. Their patron saint was Mary Magdalene, not the Mary Magdalene of the Bible that some people might be familiar with, but rather the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which profess the belief that Jesus had 2 teachings, one for the stupid people that he gave to most of his disciples, and his special teachings for his favorite disciples, Mary Magdalene, who he kissed on the mouth a lot, according to the Gospel of Magdalene, and John, who was another one of his favorite disciples, who he gave a special secret teaching to according to their mythos. Now, this was abolished as an order in 1312 for heresy. A number of insiders within the Templars admitted to carrying out a variety of acts involving the worship of Baphomet, an androgynous goat god. That it gets dark. But the order was shut down around 1312. That's actually Bernard de Clairvaux. Some of my slides got screwed up when I closed my PowerPoint and reopened it. That's not supposed to be there, but it works for the moment. Bernard de Clairvaux, for some reason, really liked portraying himself suckling on the milk from Mary. These are just several pictures of Bernard obviously receiving the divine milk. And I think that there's something in a weird, playful way that they get off on involving the fact that Mary has these 2 different characteristics of an identity, as on the one hand, the whore and the divine sacred mother, the virgin, right? There's something weird about that as far as like concordant, a unification of opposites that seems to be part of the rituals of various Rosicrucians and others that are into this stuff. And I had somebody who was a big fan of Bernard de Clairvaux write to me when she heard me say this on a podcast, And she said, no, 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 a lot of saints do that. You can't, that's bigoted of me to call out Bernard de Clairvaux as being a perv. I looked into it. There are no other saints that ever did this. It's just him. So I already mentioned the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, established in 1099, that has currently still, as I said, about 20,000 knights and dames active. Very, very influential in the schooling system, and a lot more that I don't fully understand. But again, their choice of regalia is disturbing. The Knights Hospitaller, which Cynthia will also be going through. Also important that these all were created around the same time, right? They were all actually originated by Benedictine Grand Masters. The Benedictine order having been itself created in around 525 by a fellow who was from a high Roman patrician family named Saint Benedict, and his twin wife Scholastica, who somehow went to a cave, had an awakening after some weird MK Ultra experience, came out of it with the idea that he has to create his own order. And somehow the temples of Saint Benedict were always located very closely to Mithraeum, Apollo temples, as the case today of one of the originating churches of the Benedictines. Now, the Benedictines were also utilizing certain things like the Hierophant of the cult of Cybele and Athos. That was also the first cult that originated self-flagellation. Whenever you have a bad thought, you got to hit yourself with a rope. And the Hierophants of Attis were also doing that as well as part of the shame-based mind control. That was carried on by the Benedictines later on in big time by the founders of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, which again, Cynthia is going to go through. Their official name was the Sovereign Hospitaller Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, rebranded in 1530 as the Knights of Malta when they moved their headquarters to Malta after Cyprus. And they were founded around the same time, right, as the Knights of Sepulchre. Keeping in mind, again, John here is not the John of the Nicene Creed Bible, but rather of the Gnostic texts, aka Nag Hammadi scriptures that were popularized by Carl Jung after World War II. It's a different thing. Another component to keep in mind is that Templar caves abound, right? That a big chunk of the Templar rituals and where they would carry out their rites it tended to be not just in Solomon's temple, but this is a cavern system that was used by the Templars in England. There's many others that have been discovered in Ireland and beyond. The thing that I think is extremely important as I round this thing out, and I think I just have 3 more slides, is the fact that the Templars modeled themselves out of a pre-existing order that was set up in 1090 called the Order of the Hashashins. The word today, assassins, finds its origin in the name Hashashin. It also finds its name originating in their use of hashish as part of their initiation ceremonies to go into an altered state where these assassins, run by a cultish order, in this case it was founded by a guy named Hassan-i Sabah, who believed in a secret set of teachings of the Quran that was like a Kabbalistic idea. Just like the Kabbalah says that there's a code within the Torah that the initiates can decipher for the elites that involves getting away from this idea of a moral God into an idea of a much darker idea of a divinity. The same thing was done for the Quran as well, with secret teachings passed down orally, they say, through Muhammad's favorites, right? And that this cult professed to actually be the inheritors of. And for some reason, they felt it was their sacred divine duty to God to be assassins and murderers. So it's a very weird idea of God if that's the way you're going to be acting in the real world. And they were not against killing their fellow Muslims. They killed many Muslim viscounts who were working for peace deals with Christians, as well as various Christians as well. But they worked very closely with the Templars. So there was a collaboration. They used actually the very same set of Grand Master and the entire structure of hierarchies, as you saw in the Templars, was also organized in the Hashashins. They were purged in 1291, and according to current scholars, they escaped, or at least residues of them escaped, to Azerbaijan and India. India, which had a grouping that ended up forming around that same time of their being purged under the Mongol fight in the 1291 period, and a group that came to be known as the Thugis, Kali worshippers. Yeah, that then grew and became a sect within India practicing black magic tantric rituals that involved basically killing and murder in order to balance the forces of the universe, that needed evil to be done in order for the universe to be balanced in some weird Manichaean light dark dualism, right? So there is a philosophy behind this that justifies this wacky shit. I'm sorry for the language of the 10-year-old, I'm so sorry, it comes out. The current incarnation of this thing took on the form of Ismailism under a figure who became a favorite of the British Empire in the early 19th century in the form of the first of the Aga Khans. And that became a local manager of India, of which there's been now several Aga Khans since then, representing a very weird multinational sort of variation of Islam, but without a state, and proclaiming, according to those who have been in the cult and have been very high up in the cult, who left the cult, to have an esoteric and an exoteric teaching structure, of which the Aga Khan professes himself to be the avatar of Vishnu, as well as Allah, as well as every god that's ever been, is this guy. So at the heart of the growth of modern Islamic terrorism, I think you have to really go to this thing that was very much tied in an alliance with Templars working under Solomon's Temple, with a very weird idea of what Solomon's Temple meant, which is not the idea that most people who have read the Bible think of Solomon's Temple. It's a very different idea, and that's important to get in mind, because they do want to rebuild Solomon's Temple. It's just that the idea of Solomon that they have is of a demonologist and necromancer who was able to sort of harness the power of demons using some weird ring that Archangel Michael gave him. It sounds crazy, but this is in the Testament of Solomon, like Gnostic texts that are believed by high-level players. They actually believe that this was a zone of global pagan religion over 3,000 years ago that has to be revived today in some other ritual. So I'll just lead out here to Cynthia. As I mentioned, the Fourth Crusade, Venice now takes control of all the maritime trade routes, just like Rome was able to backstab its former ally during the Punic Wars, and then take over all of its trade routes to become an empire. Venice, who had formerly been the junior partner of the Byzantine Empire, used their financial controls to bankroll the Fourth Crusade. And when they did that, they made sure that all of the Templars, Hospitallers, and everybody else who were involved didn't actually get to the Holy Land to fight anybody, except what they did do is they made sure that they brought them all to Constantinople, a Christian city, which they promptly raped and pillaged and destroyed. And then brought all of this loot back to Venice, which is why Venice today, if you look at any of the sculptures, they've got all of this Byzantine architecture everywhere in Venice, because they destroyed a Christian city, which gave them the money they needed to pay back their Venetian loaners, the guys who actually gave them the money to carry out a crusade at interest. They could pay them back, but they had so much loot that it was too heavy to carry the whole land. So they were like, well, let's just go back home now. And Venice came out of that the big winner, basically controlling, as the dominant hegemon. And it grew beyond this point, but this is like the thing that later on took over the English people, that they infested Amsterdam, they took over England, they turned England into an empire. And this is the thing that the founding fathers of America fought like hell to break away from and establish something much more in harmony with the principles of natural law of St. Augustine, of Cicero, of Charlemagne. And that's what we're trying to do today, to get people to realize how this dynamic has worked throughout history. What is the oligarchy afraid of? What are the types of thinking that the oligarchy is afraid of? And how can we do more of that today? So, with that, I'll leave the stage to Cynthia.